Saint Lydwine of Schiedam by George Carl Huysmans, Chapter 5. After she had entered the way of mystic substitution, and had, of her own free will, offered herself as a scapegoat for the sins of the world, Jesus threw his dominion upon her, and she lived that extraordinary existence wherein pain is as springboard for joy. The more she suffered, the more she was satisfied, and the more she wanted to suffer. She knew that she was no longer alone, that her tortures had a purpose, that they existed for the good of the Church, and that they palliated the offenses of the living and the dead. She knew that it was for the glory of God that the fragrant flower bed of her wounds grew both humble and magnificent flowers. She could verify, through her own self, the justice of St. Felice's response to the mockery of her executioner, who ridiculed her cries when she gave birth in prison before being thrown to the wild beasts in the arena. "What will you do when you're being devoured by the beasts?" asked this man. And the saint replied, "It is I who suffer now, but then, when I have been martyred, it will be another who will suffer for me, because I shall suffer for him." It is very difficult to analyze this life, so different from ours, with our modest tortures and minute joys. Our exaltations are like our own pains, mediocre. We live in a temperate climate, a zone of tepid piety, where vegetation is stunted and nature feeble. Lydwine herself had been uprooted from the sterile soil, to be transplanted into the ardent soil of the mysticism, and her sap, till then torpid, boiled over the fierce fire of love. She panted, writhed, ground her teeth, or lay half dead, and all the while she was in a state of ecstasy. She no longer lived except for in one extreme or the other, the exuberance of her jubilation compensating for her intense suffering. She expressed it very simply. "The consolations that I experience are proportionate to the trials I endure, and I find them so exquisite I would not exchange them for all the pleasures of man." Nevertheless, the horde of her maladies continued to overwhelm her, and attacked her with a fresh upsurge of fury. Her stomach finally burst like a ripe fruit, and they had to apply a woolen cushion to push back her entrails and keep them from coming out. Soon, when they wished to move her to change the sheets of the bed, they had to bind her limbs firmly together with napkins and cloths, for otherwise her body would have fallen to pieces and come away in the hands of those who tended her. By a miracle evidently intended to certify the superhuman origin of these ills, Lydwine no longer ate food, or scarcely ate any. In 30 years she ate only as much as a healthy person usually consumes in 3 days. During the first years of her life as a recluse, her only food from morning to night was one slice of apple as thick as of the sacred host, which they toasted for her in the hearth with a pair of tongs. And if she occasionally attempted to swallow a mouthful of bread steeped in beer or milk, she was only able to do so with great difficulty. After a time, the thin slice of apple became too much for her, and she had to content herself with a drop of wine and sugared water, flavored with a dash of cinnamon or nutmeg and a morsel of date. Next, she sustained herself solely on watered-down wine, wetting her lips with it rather than drinking it, absorbing about half a pint per week. Very often, as spring water was expensive in Schiedam, they gave her river water from the Meuse, which was either salty or fresh, according to the ebb and flow of the tide, for the river runs into the Schied quite near the town. She preferred to have it drawn for her as the tide came in, when it was bitter and briny, because then it turned into the most delicious drink for her. When she was reduced to sustaining herself with only this liquid, sleep, which was already rare, disappeared completely, and her nights were endless, implacable, as she remained motionless on her back, the skin of which was raw. Those attending her reckoned that she had not slept as much as 3 good nights in 30 years. In the end, she could not swallow anything at all, and even the wish to sleep, which was only, according to biographers, a temptation of the devil, disappeared as well. A sort of lethargy overcame her, each time she prepared to meditate on the Passion of the Christ, and she struggled in vain against the drowsiness. "Give up these exercises and sleep," said Jean Pot to her. "You will come back to them later." She obeyed, and her state of irresistible torpor ceased. The scarcity of food and perpetual insomnia caused her to be subjected to the most cruel humiliations and base insinuations. All the town talked of the remarkable case of the young girl, who neither ate nor slept, yet remained alive, and the fame of this marvel was widespread. To many her story seemed impossible. They ignored the numerous facts of the kind recorded in the biographies of saints who were predecessors or contemporaries of Lydwine. Attracted by curiosity, many came to visit and searched her house relentlessly, submitting her to ongoing inquisition. Her detractors did not number 4 only, as in the case of Job's friends. They were legion. Most of them saw only a head split from forehead to nose, a face falling apart like a pomegranate, a body whose migrating flesh had to be compressed like that of a mummy by the interlacing bandages, and disgust overcame them at the sight of so many infirmities. Their curiosity was disappointed. Where they had expected to find a rather comely face which would have moved them, or a somewhat bizarre physiognomy which they could have mocked, they only discovered a Gorgon's mask. They only saw the surface. They perceived no source of light behind the horn panes of this broken lanterns, set in a corner of the dark. And yet her soul shone through, set aglow with love, for Jesus filled it with his exclamations and gilded it with his radiance. They avenged themselves for their disappointment by accusing her of trickery. They said that she did not really observe this diet, that she wolfed down food when she was alone, and that she drank at night. They pestered her with questions, prepared pitfalls for her, tried to get her to contradict herself. To all their interrogations, she answered simply, "I do not understand you. You must believe it impossible to subsist without the help of food, but God is master. I presume, and can act as he wishes. You affirm that my maladies should kill me, but they will not kill me till the Savior wishes it." And, she added, for those who showed hypocritical pity, "I am not to be pitied. I am happy as I am, and if the recitations of a Hail Mary would avail to cure me, I would not recite it." Others went still further, and brutally insulted her, crying, "Make no mistake, my beauty, we are not duped by you. You pretend to live without nourishment, but you feed yourself secretly. You are a sly fox, as deceitful as can be." And Lydwine, a little surprised at this rage, asked them what interest she could possibly have in lying like that. "Besides," she said, "to eat is not a sin, and to not eat is not an act of glory, so far as I know." Embarrassed by the good sense of these replies, they changed their mode of attack and charged her with being possessed. The devil alone was capable of working such magic, and this play-acting was the result of a pact with him. Rare, indeed, were those who believed her to be neither a fraud nor a witch, but understood what she was in reality. A victim, ground in God's mortar, a pitiful effigy of the suffering church. Little by little, the truth prevailed. Annoyed at these conflicting accounts, the magistrates of Schiedam resolved to get at the facts of the case. For months they subjected Lydwine to incessant surveillance, and were compelled to recognize that she was a saint whose completely abnormal existence could only be explained by a particular design from on high. A fact that they promulgated in a legal document stamped with the seal of the city. They met on September 12, 1421, to verify the testimonials concerning Lydwine's life, the privation of all nourishment and of sleep, the state of the body transformed into a repugnant heap of scabs, one portion of her entrails amputated, the other teeming with parasites, and yet giving off a good smell. In short, all the details that we have enumerated. The legal document is included in its entirety in the volume of the Bollandus at the beginning of the second life of Brugmann. One ought to add to this fact, one stated all by her biographers, that Lydwine's parents preserved in a vase fragments of bone and strips of flesh that had detached themselves from her daughter's limbs, and that those remains gave off sweet perfume. Some gossips, who had heard of this wonder, ran to assure themselves of its veracity, but Lydwine, who was disturbed by these visits, implored her mother to bury those poor remains, so as not to sadden her. Petronille did so. It seems that after this promulgation of the burgomaster and municipality of Schiedam, Lydwine was left in peace, as her good faith was of public notoriety. 4 years later, however, Philip of Burgundy, having invaded Flanders, deployed a corps to occupy Schiedam. The fortress commander, who was a Frenchman, wished to assure himself that the phenomenon attested to in the town manifesto was correct. He gave as a pretext his desire to protect the saint from possible outrage, and posted a troop of 6 soldiers at her home, whom he chose from among his most honest and most religious. He then removed her family, who had to camp out in another part of town, and ordered his subordinates to take turns, so they would not lose sight of their prisoner, by day or night, and to prevent any food or drink from reaching her. They executed these orders to the letter, inspecting even the pots of ointment to be sure that they did not contain any substance that would comfort her. No one, except a widow named Catherine, was admitted to tend her, and she was searched before she entered the room. Thus they mounted guard around her bed for 9 days, and during that time they saw Lydwine a prey to extravagant tortures, dissolved in tears, but smiling, lost in ecstasy, drowning in bliss, tossed as if outside of this world by waves of joy. As for her, it is doubtful that she perceived their presence. God carried her away, far from the house, sparing her the irksome spectacle of these men whose eyes never left her. When their duty ceased, they openly certified that their captain had lived as they had been told, on air alone, without taking any food. This surveillance, therefore, only went on to prove once more Lydwine's honesty and the authenticity of the strange existence she led. Indeed, this profusion of investigations was quite unnecessary. The mistrust of a small town on the outlook, combined with the current rage for espionage in the province, made the whole affair very public. Lydwine would not have been able to swallow a mouthful of bread without all of Schiedam knowing it, but if God willed that these facts should be closely examined and proven, it was so that no doubt would remain, and such graces would not be relegated to the place of mere legend. Indeed, it must be admitted that he constantly acts this way. Did he not act in the same way in the 19th century toward Catherine Emmerich and Louise Latoux, two stigmatized saints whose lives present more than one analogy to that of Lydwine?